As someone who began power scaling in late 2019, it's safe to say that I'm fairly experienced and have noticed many things with both power scalers and the power scaling community. Thus, I've decided to make this video where I lay out 5 things I hate about the power scaling community and its members. This may become a short series, but for now, I'd like to start off with the erroneously popular idea that the literal meaning of phrases in fiction is the precise truth. The reasoning goes like this. If something is stated within a series, the most accurate interpretation is that of the literal meaning of the words within the phrase. So if a character says something like, "I'll eliminate you from existence," referring to a particular attack, the attack has the capability to literally erase you from existence, thus granting that attack existence erasure. This line of reasoning is immensely flawed for a grand variety of reasons. For one, it makes the unproven presupposition that if something is said, it is meant literally irrespective of the context. This removes any kind of creative freedom an author may have, as it sees any statement as being, quote-unquote, the word of God, as opposed to just the character expressing their belief. Sure, the author can speak through characters, especially when expressing certain ideas. However, this is not an omnipresent fact. We should judge things on a case-to-case basis rather than casting an erroneous blanket of rules that is immensely restrictive. Secondly, it ignores the idea of figures of speech or treats them as only appearing sparingly or being immensely obvious. Thirdly, it treats the literal meaning of phrases as the truth, while anything that deviates from it as being less valid or quote-unquote just another interpretation. Not acknowledging that interpreting phrases as literal is also quote-unquote just an interpretation. Fourthly, it is a very faulty way of critiquing literature, as themes, undertones, character arcs, etc. are seldom or never explicitly explained, and whether people want to acknowledge it or not, power scaling is a form of literary criticism. Take the idea of implicit storytelling, for example. If all literary media explicitly explained everything about their world and characters, it would be incredibly bland. The complexities of a story, told through non-explicit ways, makes it far more interesting and mysterious, which adds depth to the story and the viewing experience. The last thing I'll point to is that it demonstrates quite the immature level of knowledge one has on language or linguistics. While a proponent for literalism may argue that if it is generally the case that we literally mean what we say, then it is up to the critiquer of literalism to explain why, in certain scenarios, what is being said isn't literal. While the premise is true, it is not entirely so. You see, while yes, when people usually speak, the words they use are usually meant to be taken literally or in the way they are most commonly used according to the dictionary. However, this is because of the nature of those words, the regularity of their uses, and the generalizations of specific contexts. What I mean by the first part is that some words are less ambiguous than others. Words like because, I, you, think, words like this, regular, etc. are almost always used to refer to the same thing. It is seldom that they are used to refer to something outside of our conceptions of them. In other words, they are almost never used metaphorically, rhetorically, or poetically. However, words like erase, kill, God, light, power, endless, water, time, space, soul, etc. are more ambiguous and can be very context dependent. We have a general conception of what they are, and while the way they can be used is relative to our conceptions of them, they are manifested differently. For example, if a character says to another, "I want to kill you," what they mean is ultimately dependent upon the context and surrounding atmosphere, and not just the quote-unquote literal meaning of the phrase or the word kill. To exemplify it, if it's a rom-com and someone says it to their friend, it is likely meant as in they're mad at them for something they did. But if it's in a dark, depressing, and gritty show, then it is likely meant in a very serious or quote-unquote literal manner. Another example would be if Walter said to Jesse, "I will strangle you," in a casual conversation early on in the series, versus if he said it in an angered manner later on in the series when things really get serious. This all demonstrates that some words are more ambiguous than others and can be used to express different messages and ideas depending on how and where they are used. When I say regularity of use, I'm referring to just how common some words are compared to others. For example, words like I and are appear quite frequently in the English language, but words like soul or erase appear less frequently and are used in very specific instances that aren't common, so you usually wouldn't use those words. In other words, Some scenarios are more common in everyday life compared to others, causing you to use certain words more regularly compared to others. This results in the more commonly used words having a very strict meaning, which usually isn't deviated from, while others, less commonly used words, have more flexible meanings. Combining this with the generalizations of scenarios where, in everyday life, common scenarios with specific atmospheres appear, and you arrive at the conclusion that while some words are usually meant literally, this isn't because of some intrinsic biological or linguistic fact. If not, it is due to the nature and regularity of the words, alongside the commonness of specific scenarios due to our society. Thus, I argue that we should analyze things on a case-to-case basis rather than trying to generalize linguistics, which is quite erroneous due to it being a very complex topic. This is also noteworthy in fictional stories, where various thematic rules are used to enhance the story and the way it is presented. Said rules create atmospheres and scenarios that are either very rare or never happen in the real world. Coupling this with an author's free reign over how they choose to creatively express themselves, and the interpretation of words or acts in a show can be much more difficult than the real world. Just because many cases are common in the real world doesn't mean we should generalize the interpretation of these cases as it is demonstrably faulty. Furthermore, what is meant by something being quote-unquote literal is dubious, as phrases using specific words can vary in meaning for a variety of reasons. Thus, a strict definition of literal should be the most commonly used definition of a word or the first one that appears in the dictionary. Also, certain phrases can refer to very specific things that are far removed from their definitions. For example, the phrase butterflies in one's stomach. While this is an obvious and well-known figure of speech, it doesn't mean that people in everyday life or characters in fiction cannot use less obscure or create their own figures of speech that aren't as obvious as the prior. Once again, language is a very complex thing, and trying to restrict any form of personally expressed meaning on only the basis of what the individual words literally mean is immensely flawed, as explained previously. Just because the meaning of some words are more commonly used than others, or that they appear first in the dictionary, doesn't wholly take away from their possible ambiguity, and a case-to-case assessment should be opted for as opposed to resorting to erroneously assuming everything is meant literally unless proven otherwise. Once again, the commonization of word usage in certain contexts isn't sound grounds to generalize interpretations of said words. For those who aren't fully following along, all I'm advocating for is the simple restriction of the number of assumptions we enter an analysis of phrases with and allow for greater freedom of interpretations. Only once we start doing this can we begin to discuss the reasons why one interpretation is more reasonable than another without restricting ourselves to the faulty idea that, this is the way this word is most commonly used, so that's how it's most likely meant here. While that argument isn't absolutely flawed, the idea is still very restrictive in not only critiquing literature but also our understanding of language. And if you really think about it, restricting just those two things means a whole lot more than what your first impression tells you. The idea of literalism as a literary analysis tool and the way many in the powerscaling community irrationally adhere to it is something that I've briefly touched on many times in the past, with this being the most in-depth I've ever publicly talked about it. In the past, I have also alluded to the fact that I plan to make a video where I tackle it in great detail. This isn't that video. If not, it is a great summary of my thoughts and everything I'll talk about. But now that I've touched on the irrational adherence to literary literalism, I can talk about the next thing I hate, which is the hyperfixation powerscalers have on upscaling fictional series and characters. Many powerscalers seem to have this irrational desire to always create a new meta or argument that puts their favorite series above all others. They seem to find joy in being able to say, this character solos your favorite verse, or this character no diffs My Hero Academia. While some people do it to annoy others do it maliciously, where they will hold positions they know have flaws but will never be fair and assess those flaws. Rather, they will hide them and win arguments against others who aren't knowledgeable about the flaws. This can create a very faulty impression of where a character scales depending on the context of the situation. Some people will be so infatuated with how high they can scale a character that they will never stop to think if their argument is wholly sound. Their use of basic logical inference will be enough to justify the validity of the conclusion in their minds. They won't attack it from multiple different angles before concluding its soundness. Rather, they will be blinded by their desire to upscale the verse or character that they will never even think about doing such a thing. This illustrates the inability to separate one's love for a series or character from the logical assessment of the argument surrounding them. With these individuals, you can go easier on them, as they are ignorant of their bias, which is a flaw many of us have, by virtue of being human in the society we live in. On the other hand, you have those that are willfully biased, as explained previously. This hyperfixation on upscaling is arguably one of the most important factors which led to the creation of factions and dividers of fandoms in the power scaling community. However, what is likely the most important factor in this segregation and hate is the next point I'll touch on, which is the sheer bigotry and sensitivity some power scalers have. Just like how Christians and people of various ends of the political spectrum, many power scalers have unreasonable attachments to beliefs and are incredibly sensitive, hypocritical, biased, and impartial. Power scalers can be likened to Christians sometimes, as they will hold beliefs not because of their logical structure, if not because of how much they like the thing they're talking about. In this case, it is a series or a character. It reaches such a nonsensical level that they will genuinely get mad and hurl endless insults at you whenever you try to point out flaws in their belief or reasoning. This degree of sensitivity dumbfounds me, as they treat these series and the beliefs they have about them as some kind of personality trait or personal religion. Like, they'll become extremely defensive and agitated because of the series they power scale. They treat critiques of a versus or a character scaling as attacks on their person, which perplexes me. This may be due to some intrinsic human trait where, because one points out flaws in any belief they may have, they feel personally offended. Very quickly, I'd like to shout out Winner's Return in Iraqi's playlist on Instagram and Optimized on YouTube. They are some of the very few individuals I know who aren't like this, and you can have reasonable conversations with them and they will be very impartial. There may be others I know who are like this, but I haven't had enough discussions with them which will allow me to gauge if they're like this or not. Anyways, bit over. Let's continue. The people who fit into the category I speak of also do things such as be immensely critical of the scaling or just aspects of other series, but when it comes to the one they scale or like, this level of critical assessment is nowhere to be found and sometimes notably repressed. This, alongside with what I said in the second point I touched on, combines to create extremely toxic and rigid communities that absolutely abhor others who aren't a part of their fandom or who don't share the same beliefs as themselves. A great way to illustrate this would be to have a Bleach scaler going into a Naruto fandom to argue why they believe Ichigo can beat Naruto or vice versa. The ensuing chaos is honestly just an impressive display of human bias. Moving on, let's touch on the fourth topic I want to discuss, which is the ignorance many power scalers have of entailment. This relates to their bigotry and sensitivity and is manifested by power scalers making arguments that appear to be reasonable but aren't critiqued before being accepted. A good example of this is my recent video where I explain why I do not believe Pucci has infinite speed via Made in Heaven. The argument used to put Made in Heaven's speed that high is very reasonable. It uses basic logical inferences to arrive at a solid conclusion. But just because the argument is logically sound doesn't mean it is true, as what it entails creates problems. Entailment is a logical consequence of something. When I say entailment, I'm referring to the wider effects of something, what it really means in practice, stuff like that. Power scalers make arguments but don't consider what follows, which results in very faulty stances. What is impressive isn't just that it happens, but some power scalers won't even lend an ear or seriously consider the entailment of the argument. This circles back to the impartiality and bigotry I was speaking of before. While many power scalers are ignorant of entailment, something they are vastly more ignorant of is epistemology when they choose to apply radical skepticism, which is the final topic I want to touch on in this video. We all know what skepticism is, right? It is when you doubt the accuracy or validity of a claim or a set of information. There's good skepticism, which is when you don't just blindly believe everything that is said to be true or false, as children often do. However, there is also something known as bad skepticism, which is when you doubt any information to such a high degree that it makes it impossible for anything to be established as true. In other words, if skepticism can be likened to a threshold of valid information, then bad skepticism is when this threshold is far too high to be realistically met. Radical is just a way to say extreme. So when I say radical skepticism, I'm talking about the most extreme kind and worst form of skepticism. Allow me to illustrate it. If I were to say, it is a fact that dogs exist in the physical world, most people would agree with me. However, someone applying radical skepticism would question me by asking, what reason do I have to believe that? I can respond by citing countless examples of people talking about dogs and showing them pictures and videos of dogs. However, they can then question me on a plethora of things such as, how do I know those people are real? How do I know those images are real? How do I know I am even seeing or can even see what is real? I can continue to give reasons why I hold this belief, and someone can continuously apply radical skepticism to question my claims. It can reach such a point that I am unable to provide any objectively solid basis for my reasoning, and it makes it appear as if I hold a faulty belief. This type of attack on reasoning may seem reasonable in isolation, but it shows a great ignorance of the topic of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. Radical skepticism, its relation to epistemology, and what it entails for reality as a whole is an immensely extensive topic and can be seen as the ultimate and most fundamental basis for any and all reasoning. It delves into ideas such as the Munchausen trilemma, infinite regression, the origin or starting point of knowledge itself, etc. I unknowingly touched on this topic in the past as I noticed its application and referred to it as the why man fallacy, which is when someone continuously asks, why is X true? Given the philosophical nature of this topic, there are many different views, with the answer not being as clear-cut as some things in practice are. Rather than trying to solve it, my answer is that the stance of radical skepticism is right. There's no such thing as knowing the truth with absolute certainty. We can only believe to know and work with incomplete knowledge. Uncertainties will always exist, as absolute certainty in anything is unattainable. It shouldn't be something we try to achieve. Rather, we should merely attempt to approximate it as best as we can. We should live a life based on justified belief, not absolute certainty. Again, this is an immensely extensive topic that isn't suited for this channel. I plan on making another channel where I'll discuss the real world as opposed to the fictional world, and there I'll discuss this in the detail it deserves. But all I'll say for now is, if a power scaler employs radical skepticism as a means to demonstrate why someone is wrong, they are only displaying their ignorance of epistemology and or maliciously using the ignorance others have of it. If someone witnesses a discussion where another person employs radical skepticism and is ignorant of the nuances surrounding it, it will appear as if the other person's position is flawed, when this isn't inherently the case, as it is just isolating something which is universal. That something is the impossibility of knowledge itself, and how everything we say we know is merely us saying we believe we have a justified belief. And yeah, those are 5 things I hate about power scaling and power scalers. I was planning on talking about 5 more things that I hate in this video, but it's already gone on for too long. I may make a second or third part at some point in the future, but for now, that's it. If you disagree with what I've said or want to share an experience you've had with one of the discussed topics, drop it down in the comment section. I just ask you to be civil since I know how some people can be. And that's it. Take care, guys. Certain ideas. However, this is not an omnipresent fact, and we should just because the meaning of some words are more commonly used than others, or that they appear first in the dictionary, doesn't wholly take away from their possible ambiguity, and a case-to-case assessment should be opted for as opposed to resorting to erroneously assuming everything is meant literally unless proven otherwise.